You know that feeling when you're driving late at night on a familiar highway and suddenly you see an exit that you swear was never there before? That moment when your GPS shows nothing but blank space where you're standing and every rational part of your brain screams that something is fundamentally wrong? If you've ever experienced that creeping dread of being somewhere that shouldn't exist, then you need to hear what happened to me and my girlfriend Sarah last month, because what we found when we took that wrong exit has changed everything I thought I knew about the world we live in. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday when we were driving back from visiting Sarah's parents in Ohio. The interstate stretched endlessly ahead of us, those familiar orange streetlights creating pools of amber light in the darkness. I had driven this exact route dozens of times over the past 3 years, knew every rest stop, every billboard, every curve in the road by heart. Sarah was asleep in the passenger seat, her head tilted against the window, and I was running on my third energy drink and pure determination to get home. That's when I saw it, an exit ramp that seemed to materialize out of nowhere between two exits I knew were supposed to be 15 miles apart. The sign read, Millhaven 2 miles, in that standard green highway font, but something about it felt wrong, like someone had photoshopped it into reality. My first instinct was to keep driving, to trust my memory and stick to the route I knew, but my fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and my bladder was about to burst. The next confirmed exit wasn't for another 20 miles, and I figured even if this was some small town I'd somehow overlooked all these years, there had to be a gas station somewhere. I took the exit, and immediately the world felt different, like driving through invisible curtains of static electricity. The off-ramp curved longer than it should have, spiraling down through what seemed like layers of fog that hadn't been there moments before on the main highway. The first thing that hit me was the silence. Not the normal quiet of a small town at night, but a complete absence of sound that made my ears ring and my skin crawl. No insects, no distant traffic hum, no wind through trees. Just this oppressive, suffocating quiet that seemed to swallow the sound of our car engine. Sarah stirred beside me, blinking awake as we reached the bottom of the ramp and found ourselves on what looked like Main Street of a perfectly preserved 1950s American town. The streetlights were those old-fashioned globe types that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow, and every building looked like it had been pulled straight from a Norman Rockwell painting, if Norman Rockwell had painted his subjects with too many teeth and shadows that moved independently of their sources. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that prickle of recognition when something is deeply wrong with your surroundings, hit that like button right now, because you're going to relate to every terrifying detail of what happened next. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because the places I'm going to show you in future videos will challenge everything you thought you knew about reality. The buildings lining the street looked functional enough. A barber shop with its red and white pole spinning lazily despite no visible power source. A diner with neon signs advertising world's best coffee and open 24 hours in letters that flickered with an intensity that hurt to look at directly. There was a movie theater with a marquee displaying titles I'd never heard of, The Backwards Man and She Comes at Dawn, and below that in smaller letters, Now Playing Forever. Every storefront was illuminated from within by that same harsh, unnatural light, but when I squinted through the windows, I couldn't make out any details of the interiors, just vague shapes that might have been furniture or might have been something else entirely moving just beyond the edge of vision. Sarah grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, her fingernails digging into my skin as she whispered, "This place isn't on any map. I checked my phone the moment we got off the highway, and there's nothing here. No signal, no GPS, nothing." Her voice was shaking, and when I looked at my own phone, the screen showed we were apparently driving through an empty field in the middle of nowhere. No roads, no buildings, just blank green space according to every mapping service I tried.
but we were clearly driving down a perfectly paved street lined with businesses that looked like they'd been operating for decades. I pulled into the parking lot of what appeared to be the town's only gas station, one of those old full-service places with attendants and everything. The pumps were ancient, the kind with numbers that flipped manually, and there was a man in coveralls standing beside them who had been watching our car approach with an intensity that made my stomach turn.
He was smiling, but his smile was too wide, stretching his face in ways that human mouths simply shouldn't be able to stretch. As I got out of the car, he approached with jerky, unnatural movements, like someone who had learned to walk by watching videos but had never actually done it themselves. "Welcome to Millhaven," he said, and his voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere behind me, even though he was standing directly in front of me. "You folks look like you could use some gas and maybe something to eat. We don't get many visitors here, especially not this time of night." His eyes never blinked, not once during the entire conversation, and when he gestured toward the diner across the street, I noticed his fingers were just slightly too long, each joint extending just a fraction further than human anatomy should allow. The smell hit me then. Something like burning electrical wires, mixed with that sweet, cloying scent of flowers left too long in stagnant water. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, seeping out of the storm drains, drifting from the open windows of the buildings, rising up from the very asphalt beneath our feet. Sarah gagged beside me and covered her nose with her shirt, her eyes watering from whatever was in the air. The gas station attendant's smile somehow got even wider when he noticed our discomfort, and he let out a laugh that sounded like metal grinding against metal. I told him we just needed gas and directions back to the highway, trying to keep my voice steady and normal, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in the car and drive in any direction until we found somewhere that existed on a map. He nodded enthusiastically, that horrifying smile never wavering, and began filling our tank while humming a tune I'd never heard before, but that somehow felt familiar, like a song from a childhood nightmare I'd forgotten until that moment. The numbers on the pump spun wildly, clicking through amounts that made no mathematical sense, sometimes going backwards, sometimes jumping forward by impossible increments. While he worked, I noticed movement in the windows of the surrounding buildings. Not people exactly, but shapes that moved with too many limbs or not enough. Silhouettes that seemed to fold in on themselves before reforming into something almost human. In the diner window, I could see figures seated at tables, but they never moved, never lifted their cups or turned their heads, just sat in perfect stillness like mannequins arranged in a tableau of normal life. The barber shop showed a customer in the chair, but the barber's hands seemed to have too many joints, bending in directions that made my eyes water to follow. That's when Sarah pointed to something that made my blood freeze in my veins. At the far end of the street, barely visible in the strange yellow glow of the streetlights, was another car exactly like ours. Same make, same model, same color, even what looked like the same license plate number. It was parked in front of a building I hadn't noticed before, something that looked like a small hotel or boarding house with a sign that read, "Vacancy always available." In the driver's seat was a figure that looked exactly like me, and in the passenger seat, someone who looked exactly like Sarah. They weren't moving, just sitting there, staring straight ahead, but even from this distance, I could see that their smiles were too wide, just like the gas station attendants. I need you to pause here for a moment because I want you to understand something. If you've ever had an experience where reality didn't feel quite right, where you found yourself somewhere that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of the world, I need you to leave a comment right now. Just write, "I've been somewhere that doesn't exist," and nothing else. Don't explain what happened, don't give details if you're not ready, but let others know they're not alone. Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to realize they're not going crazy, that there are others who have walked through these impossible places and lived to tell about it. The gas station attendant finished with our tank and turned to me with that mechanical, too wide smile, his unblinking eyes reflecting the neon light from the diner across the street.
"That'll be $33.33, he said, and I noticed that his voice now sounded like multiple people speaking in perfect unison, a chorus of identical tones that seemed to echo from inside my own head. I handed him my credit card with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady, and he ran it through a machine that looked like it belonged in a museum, one of those old manual credit card imprinters with the carbon paper.
While we waited for the transaction to process, he leaned closer to me, close enough that I could see my own reflection multiplied infinitely in his pupils, and whispered, "You know, most folks who stop here decide to stay. We've got everything you need right here in Millhaven. Good food at the diner, comfortable rooms at the hotel, friendly neighbors who always wave when you pass by."
Why rush back to that highway when you could be part of our community? His breath smelled like ozone and copper pennies, and when he spoke, I could see that his teeth went back much further than they should have, row after row disappearing into the darkness of his throat. I grabbed the receipt and practically dragged Sarah back to the car, my hands fumbling with the keys as the attendant watched us with that horrible, knowing smile. As we pulled away from the gas station, I caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror, and I swear he was waving goodbye with fingers that were now definitely longer than they had been when we arrived, each digit stretching and curling in ways that made my vision blur just trying to process what I was seeing. The problem was finding our way out. The street that had brought us into town seemed to loop back on itself no matter which direction we drove. Every turn led us past the same buildings, the same smiling figures in the windows, the same impossibly perfect recreation of small-town America that felt like a movie set designed by someone who had only heard descriptions of human civilization secondhand. The gas gauge, which had been full when we left the station, was now showing empty again, and our duplicate car was following us now, maintaining a constant distance of exactly 1 block, its occupants still wearing those stretched, inhuman smiles. Sarah was crying now, not the normal tears of fear or frustration, but something thicker and darker that left stains on her cheeks like oil or old blood. She kept saying that she could hear voices calling her name from inside the buildings we passed, familiar voices of friends and family members who were supposedly hundreds of miles away, all inviting her to come inside and stay forever. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I was fighting my own battle against the whispers that seemed to be seeping through the car radio, even though it wasn't turned on. Voices promising rest and peace and an end to the exhausting struggle of existing in the real world. Time moved strangely in Millhaven. My watch had stopped at 3:33 a.m., the exact moment we had entered the town, but the darkness outside never seemed to deepen or lighten, remaining in that perpetual state of pre-dawn gloom that made it impossible to judge how long we had been driving in circles. The buildings began to look different on each pass, subtle changes that I almost convinced myself I was imagining, until I realized the movie theater was now showing The Endless Drive and They Never Leave on its marquee. The diner's neon sign had changed too, now advertising last meals and final conversations in that same painful flickering light. It was Sarah who figured out how to escape, though I'm not sure escape is the right word for what we did. She noticed that our duplicate car always turned a few seconds after we did, mimicking our movements with mechanical precision. She had me make a sudden right turn without signaling, and for just a moment we were ahead of our doppelgangers, out of sync with whatever pattern had been keeping us trapped. In that brief window of freedom, we saw it. a break in the buildings, a gap that looked like it might lead back to the highway. I gunned the engine and drove straight toward that gap, ignoring the way the buildings on either side seemed to lean inward, as if trying to close the opening before we could reach it. The gas station attendant was standing in the middle of the road behind us, no longer bothering to maintain his human disguise, his limbs extending and multiplying, his smile now taking up his entire face. In the rearview mirror, I watched him wave goodbye with what must have been a dozen hands, all of them reaching toward our fleeing car with desperate, grasping fingers. The transition back to the real highway felt like breaking through the surface of deep water after nearly drowning. That sudden rush of normal air and normal sounds and normal darkness that exists in the spaces between streetlights on ordinary interstates. Our phones immediately found signal again, the GPS recalculated our route, and according to every piece of technology we carried, we had never left the highway at all. The timestamp on our photos from inside Millhaven showed only static, and the receipt from the gas station had turned into a blank piece of paper that crumbled to dust when I tried to examine it. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The detail that makes me question everything about the nature of reality and the spaces we think we understand. When we finally made it home and I was uploading our trip photos to back up on my computer, I found one image I didn't remember taking. It was a picture of Main Street in Millhaven, taken from inside our car, showing all those perfectly preserved 1950s buildings bathed in that sickly yellow light. But in the windows of every single building, pressed up against the glass and smiling those two wide smiles, were faces I recognized. My coworkers, my neighbors, friends from college I hadn't spoken to in years, all of them staring directly into the camera with expressions of infinite patience, as if they were waiting for something specific to happen. And at the bottom of the photo, barely visible in the digital timestamp, were coordinates that led to an empty field in rural Ohio, exactly where our GPS had said we were driving when we thought we were in Millhaven. I've checked those coordinates on satellite images, and there's nothing there but farmland and a few abandoned buildings. But sometimes, late at night when I'm having trouble sleeping, I'll pull up those satellite images and stare at that empty space, and I swear I can see the faint outline of streets that shouldn't be there, the suggestion of buildings that exist just slightly outside the wavelength of normal reality. If this story has shaken something loose in your memory, if you're remembering places you've been that didn't quite make sense, then you need to be here for what's coming next. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell because I've been collecting stories from people who have found themselves in places that don't appear on any map, and what I'm learning suggests that Millhaven isn't unique. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of these impossible places scattered across the country, all of them waiting patiently for travelers who take the wrong exit at exactly the right time. The most disturbing part isn't that these places exist, it's that they seem to be growing, spreading, creating new exits and new reasons for people to stop and stay forever. Because that's what Millhaven wanted, what all these places want. Not just visitors, but permanent residents. People who will sit in the windows and smile those impossible smiles and wait for the next car full of lost travelers to stumble into their perfect, terrible little world. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I wonder if we really escaped at all, or if we're still driving those endless loops through streets that smell like burning wires and rotting flowers, telling ourselves we made it home, while our bodies sit motionless in windows that face a road no GPS will ever find.